Today, I want to talk about a topic that I call charismatic religious manipulation. Charismatic religious manipulation. It sort of happens, or can happen across the board in with different spiritual teachers, religious gurus, both mainstream as well as New Age. And I've observed some patterns that I'd like to discuss, to share with you some observations. And I want to do that by focusing on three different people whom you may or may not have heard of, but they're, in terms of my own development over the years, these are people I definitely heard of. One is Jim Jones, another person is Jim Bakker, another one is Chogyum Trungpa. And one of the most notorious or infamous would be clearly Jim Jones. Jim Jones started back sometime in the 60s perhaps as a Pentecostal preacher. And over the years he gained an incredible following in terms of numbers of people. He moved from Indiana to Northern California and then down to San Francisco before he then moved his followers down to Guyana, which is in the northeastern coast of South America, where he had Jonestown. And you may have heard about Jonestown and Don't Drink the Kool-Aid. Anyway, in 1978, there was some some perspectives being presented to U.S. leaders that he was not allowing people to leave his very extensive communal development. And so a person called Congressman Ryan went down there, and eventually he was assassinated by Jim Jones's followers. And following that, 909 people committed a mass suicide. Including 300 children were involved in that. And they had cyanide mixed in with Kool-Aid, and it was really one of the largest mass suicides perhaps in our history. And so he was known as Jim Jones in Jonestown, and he had quite a following. The second person is probably not known hardly at all. His name is Jim Bakker, and it's spelled with B-A-K-E-R, not the B-A-K-K-E-R, which is perhaps far more notorious as a televangelist in the United States, who got caught with his reaching the cookie jar, having a little hanky-panky with the secretary and perhaps other people. So he fell from grace in the public eye, although he's back out there now, I understand. So that's Jim Bakker, the televangelist. I'm referring to a whole different person called Jim Bakker. The reason I even know about him is because of a documentary that I recently viewed called The Source Family. The Source Family. And in the 1960s and was it 70s? In the early 70s, he became this guru in Los Angeles, and it was clearly sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And he had quite a following, very devoted following of communal living. And eventually he went from Los Angeles to Hawaii, where he died, and so his followers eventually dispersed. And that was in 1975 that he died. If you're familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, you may be much more familiar with a person named Chogyum Trungpa. Chogyum Trungpa. T-R-U-N-G-P-A is his last name. And he was one of the first Tibetans to establish in the West, actually started in Scotland, Tibetan Buddhist teachings, and eventually then he came to the United States and eventually established well-known Naropa Institute. And these three particular people, his documentary is entitled Crazy Wisdom, The Life and Times of Chogyum Trungpa Rinpoche. Rinpoche is a sort of a term of endearment, meaning precious one, sort of a title, a term of endearment. And he was very, very, very influential, although he's been dubbed as the bad boy of Buddhism, because he was into sex and very different types of lifestyles. I mean, very open sex life. And all three of these people energetically have something energetically in common with each other. There's a lot of similarities. And I'm going to go into that briefly here in a moment. But what is more important, given the title of this, Charismatic Religious Manipulation, is in these documentaries, which are actually listed down in the written words we're seeing this video being presented. Seeing these documentaries, I had a chance to read the energy patterns of his followers 35, 25 years later. And I am very familiar with a number of people considered to be gurus who really are, their energetic patterns are far from being desirable. From my point of view, it was a spiritual teacher. However, it's the impact that occurred in these in these followers that are still devoted to their, and well, in some ways, Jim Jones, and maybe a different story to some extent, with the mass suicide. But there were some followers that survived that, or well, actually some ran off into the jungle when the mass suicide took place, and some people were not there on the day that the mass suicide took place. Some of his followers were in Guyana, but not there at the time of the actual Kool-Aid suicide. And but it's the impact on the followers, I said even 25, 35 years later, that I had never really looked at, and so I hadn't watched these documentaries. I went back and watched them again, parts of them, to look and see what was going on, and this is quite separate from their teachings, what they were talking about. And I'm going to explain this and why religious manipulation, what I'm calling religious manipulation, from charismatic teachers, gurus, preachers, etc., can really be a disservice or dysfunctionality for the followers. Even though they may feel like their lives are being uplifted, but from a spiritual, energetic point of view, it's really messing up their patterns, their potentiality. And I was very surprised to start finding this pattern again and again amongst the followers from these three different charismatic religious leaders. They're very, very different. Jim Jones, he was a white person in a Pentecostal tradition that really attracted a number of black people. Then you have, and many of those were what we would call lower socioeconomic people, both white and black, but not everybody was poor, but it was very much of a socialistic commune that he set up in Ukiah. Took care of the elderly, did some wonderful things, it seemed like, but at some point he really messed up, and it really became a dysfunctional situation from my point of view. Now we go to Jim Bakker. Here we're middle class, upper middle class, primarily white kids in the 60s, opening up to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, often in their late teens or early 20s. And this Jim Bakker became a father figure to them in many ways. And then thirdly, Chogyum Trungpa had a whole different following. It's probably a whole different following. It's sort of like the intelligentsia of the United States, very educated people in the United States, or North America and also other parts of the world, who be really into deep spiritual paths already, many of them, being attracted to this pretty incredible, brilliant person. But despite that wide range of socioeconomic, educational differences between these people, the energetic patterns that resulted are the same, regardless of whether they were highly educated or not extensively educated, regardless of whether they were on the poor side of the economic scale or the upper end of the economic scale. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about these three people in terms of energetic readings. A number of years ago, I developed some abilities to read energetic patterns of people, and at the same time, I was coming to have an understanding of energetic structures, functions, and abilities, which, as they become more and more developed, allow us to be more and more like what I refer to as a shaman, or energetically, and you could even say spiritually developed. I won't go into all of that at this point in time, but to share just a few things. When I look at the early years versus the later years of these three, I'll call them gurus for lack of a better term right now. So I use the same term for all three people, even though you would not apply the word guru in a Christian context, as with the Pentecostal Jim Jones. But these three gurus, in their earlier years, they were fascinating, as it shows in the documentary, and they were rather energetically developed. All three of them started off in the earlier years with all chakras open, and that's not so important, but that's the term people are familiar with. All of them were open. The average person in the United States probably has 2 or 3 chakras, maybe 4 chakras open. And in my framework, there are 10 primary chakras, and all of them start off with 10 primary chakras. Another factor, which is really probably the most important in terms of understanding how they could be so charismatic, so effective in getting people to follow them, is something that I call energetic abilities. And we're basically born with these. If we develop them in a previous incarnation, which to me meant that you had to be fairly energetically, quite energetically and/or spiritually developed, you develop these abilities that continues over when the being reincarnates. Try to keep that real simple. When the being reincarnates, certain factors that were developed for the being that continues over across lifetimes comes in the next incarnation. And that's there for the person. Now, as the person becomes more and more energetically developed in that lifetime, they can take more and more advantage of those energetic abilities that they developed in previous incarnations. But even if they never become energetically developed, and even if they do become a religious manipulator, or what I would call an energy sucker, they still could be considered very brilliant. Chogyum Trungpa was incredibly brilliant, insightful, incredibly so. And if you look at all three of the documented these three people, there's a lot to admire about each of the three people and their abilities to be to accomplish things in the arts, following, look at various religious spiritual traditions, the intent they have for a community that really serves the people of all ages. And it went across. And really one of the things about Jim Baker was he really broke down the color barrier long before it was becoming socially acceptable. So these three people were really quite energetically developed. And to try to keep it simple, my understanding, there are 20 energetic abilities systems. And both Jim Jones and Jim Baker came in with 12 of them developed. Most people have 0 developed. maybe one, maybe two. But these were just really quite developed. Chogyum Trungpa was like off the scale. That guy was so incredibly energetically developed. Because I mean, he was indeed considered a reincarnation of a major Tibetan Buddhist Lama. And I have no doubt about that, he because he's just incredible reading. He was like off the charts in many ways, at the level sort of similar to like the Dalai Lama, which is not that uncommon in a lot of Tibetan Buddhism, but the guy was incredibly developed, incredibly brilliant. And at some point in their lives, something happens where it's a real shift, and they come and they start to literally extract intensity of energy, or extract energy from other people, their followers primarily. And because for whatever reasons they're expending their own energy, so to speak, in ways that they're sort of becoming drained within themselves, and so they then start to, for whatever reasons, emotional reasons, who knows what, they start to extract, suck, so to speak, the energetic intensity from other people, particularly their followers. And when that happens, and I'm finding this to be universal, such people begin to function only with the first two chakras open. In these cases, all three of these people went from 10 chakras open to 2. And that's a real difference in terms of energetic functioning. And if we look at these three religious gurus, later in their life in the documentary, they've all sort of shifted to this very limited or limiting effect. They can still be very brilliant, very charismatic, very insightful, finding practical solutions, and very having a very enticing presentation, so that people are truly interested in what they're saying, what they're doing, which can be good things. However, what I found was this, with the followers of Jim Jones, who survived that suicide, or were not there at that time. I don't know if anyone survived it other than escaping for it when it was starting, when Jim Jones was telling people to take the Kool-Aid. Across the board, there are certain energetic patterns that the followers of all three, as indicated in the documentaries, I'm just reading the energies of the people in the documentaries, who often speak quite positively about their guru. I mean, they were critical of Jim Jones in many ways, but they also said what his dream was, what his ideal was very positive, and some of them were really glad that they did partake in that, because it was like an incredible dream of how a community could be. And what happens, or what happened, because over time, you're getting a 20-year span in some of these documentaries, or 15-year span, or 10-year span, watching the people, when this took place in the 70s, Chogyum Trungpa died in 1987. So we have now 25 to 35, maybe almost 40 years since their guru was alive and instructing them, leading them. But all of them, in many ways, have a very positive, sort of loving feeling for their guru. And they can be very bright people. They're not messed up people. However, the way I would sum it up is their spiritual growth has been stunted. Their spiritual growth has been stunted. Most of these followers, not all, but almost most of them, it was just incredibly surprising to find this with Chogyam Trungpa's followers. as far as this energetic development, all of them, almost all of them that I was reading the energies of, had only the first two chakras open, even though they themselves were not energy suckers or energy extractors like their guru. But the most important thing is that there was a certain energetic structure that I call the soul body, that all of us have, and it's developed in various extents with different people. I mean, someone like the Dalai Lama has it highly, highly, highly developed, and the average person has it developed to some extent. But if you want to think of us as being made up of vibratory patterns, and these vibratory patterns can have like waves. You know, you have a frequency, and it's up and down. You get a sense of the wave there, the amplitude. To use this as a sort of a symbolic way of thinking about it. To be really alive, we need to have these frequencies vibrating at the optimum for their development, how developed they are, if for any situation. However, it's sort of like that the ceiling and the floor have now suppressed downward so that the vibrational quality is now limited. I call it suppressed vibration, suppressed frequency pattern. If that occurs, I found by viewing these followers 25, 35 years later, if that occurs, you cannot develop extensively like moving in the direction of like Chogyum Trungpa was in his earlier years, or like the Dalai Lama, or really some really high-level spiritual teachers. You just can't. It's like it's stunted growth. You can have great ideas, you can have great meditation practices, but it's totally limited about how far a person can go. And I'm just totally surprised at particularly the Chogyum Trungpa followers who are really bright people. Really bright people. I mean, I have a lot of positive feeling for Tibetan Buddhism. And they may indeed be very spiritually focused. But when I look at the energetic patterns, they're nowhere near about moving towards how Chogyam Trungpa was in his earlier years, or like the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is sort of like one of the models, the role model here of what people can eventually be if they become more and more energetically spiritually developed, doing different practices over different lifetimes. And while the person may feel like being with their guru, being a positive impact, like psychologically, emotionally on them, and I have no doubt that it did have a positive impact in many cases. But until that's what I call the soul body. Until the frequencies, the vibrational patterns there are not suppressed or unsuppressed, it greatly limits how far you're ever going to be energetically, spiritually developed. And I use the word energetic and spiritual almost interchangeably here. Because when I look at the Dalai Lama's energetic structures, which are very, very high, although it can be higher, high meaning it's extensively developed, that that if those patterns are suppressed, you end up having good religious followers doing good religious deeds, perhaps. But there's no real freedom for the person within to really grow and be themselves, to, we could say, like be a bodhisattva, which is the Buddhist concept of one interpretation, is you become enlightened, or some degree of enlightenment, then you reincarnate to help other people. And if you do not develop energetically, and a lot of that will be suppressed and limited by this suppression around the soul-body energetic functioning, then the extent to which one will grow is very limited. This has been my observation. Little footnote here. There is a person that's considered to be the reincarnation of Chogyum Trungpa. He's in his mid-20s, early 20s at this point in time. And when I tuned in, I happened to find him on the internet, just quite by accident. And when I read his energetic patterns, he's back to being just like the previous incarnation of the Chogyum Trungpa, before his energy got really messed up. And so apparently, it can be there, it will be there in the future incarnations, but you got to wait till the future incarnation. But the ideal is to go beyond that suppression of the vibratory, we'll call it vibratory intensity, to be able to really grow. And so, how do you know the person's religious manipulator? I don't know. I mean, I read people's energies, but basically I now just sort of like, if they're taught like what I call a platitude motor mouth, put all these platitudes out about the nature of spiritual existence, such as the only permanence is impermanence, which is a major teaching, but they just spout it out. Or what you resist persists, which is another one of those little simple platitudes. And it sums up, how we're not working, life is not working so well for us. But just spouting out those attitudes, my eyes roll up with a lot of the New Age teachers, because they just spout that right and left, and like, so what? And then I turn in energies and say, oh yeah, they know how to talk the talk, but they can't walk the talk. So I hope this gives you some reflections, some insights about your own energetic and spiritual path. And basically I would say this: if you're with some spiritual teacher and it just doesn't feel right, maybe it's time to walk away. And it's okay. It truly is okay. But you just have to go inside. Eventually it's up to each one of us individually to say, this is not working for me. Or there's some good things here, but something doesn't feel right. Something just doesn't feel right. So eventually, ultimately, it's up to each individual person for us to make choices. Some choices are better than others. So I hope this gives you some ideas, and thank you very much for listening.